Dickie Betts was another one of those southern boys who come out of the South playing a guitar like he was born with it on. He always had a great tone and a style of playing that was just hard to put your thumb on and give it a label. One thing about him, he was a perfect fit alongside Duane in the Allman Brothers Band. Although they only got to play together a few years, they worked up some of the most melodic twin guitar solos that will be etched in our minds forever. If you enjoy this video, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. I'd appreciate it. Now on to Dickie Betts. He was born Forrest Richard Betts in West Palm Beach, Florida on December 12, 1943, but was raised up on the west coast of Florida in the town of Bradenton, which is just south of Tampa Bay. He grew up in a musical family, listening to traditional bluegrass, country music, and western swing. He started playing ukulele at 5, and as his hands got bigger, moved on up to the mandolin, banjo, and finally the guitar. At 16, he started playing in a series of rock bands on the Florida circuit, up the East Coast and on into the Midwest. In 1967, him and a bassist named Barry Oakley played together in a band called The Second Coming. His connection with Barry and that band would later lead him to the Allman Brothers. Dickie was to be one of the founding members of the Allman Brothers Band. It was Dickie who was said to have given the band its name. In 1969, the band quickly gelled once Duane Allman got his baby brother Greg to come back from the West Coast and play organ, sing, and write songs for the group. Of course, Duane was the main guitarist of the group at the time, but after Duane's death in 1971, Dickie stepped up and took over Duane's role and kept the band going. In March of 1971, the band was to record their Live at the Fillmore album. It was a double album, 4 sides of vinyl, with only 7 songs. Some very long jam songs, including Dickie's instrumental In Memory of Elizabeth Reed. The song here on the live version is so much better than the studio cut from a year earlier. Naturally, it's about twice as long, too. In Memory of Elizabeth Reed was said to have been inspired by a woman Dickie was involved with in Macon, Georgia. She was said to be the girlfriend of guitarist-songwriter Boz Scaggs. She was Hispanic and somewhat dark and mysterious, and she really used it to her advantage and played it to the hilt, Dickie said. To hide her identity, the composition is named after a headstone he saw in the Rose Hill Cemetery, where the band members would often hang out in the early relax and write songs. In his book, Greg Allman says, a lot more went on in that cemetery than just relaxing and writing songs, but I'll leave the rest of that quote for a Greg Allman video someday. Duane, Greg, and Barry Oakley, along with Elizabeth Reed, are all laid to rest in the Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon, Georgia. In Memory of Elizabeth Reed was the first of many instrumentals Dickie Betts would write and record. There's no doubt that the Allman Brothers Band Live at the Fillmore East is one of the best live albums ever recorded. Dickie said during that time on stage, it was 6 hearts beating together at the same time, and it sounds like it too. The one thing I think gets lost sometimes is how great of a bass player Barry Oakley was. Not taking anything away from the other 5 musicians, but Barry never seemed to get the recognition he deserved. This guy was a great bass player. Don't believe me? Just put on a set of headphones and zero in on Barry's bass lines and groove on that live album. Pretty impressive in my opinion. The leader and heart and soul of the Allman Brothers Band was without a doubt Duane Allman. But after being killed later that same year that the live album was recorded, Dickie and Duane's baby brother Greg stepped up and kept the band going. They didn't hire anyone to fill for Duane, and they played 5-piece for a time. But then, right after they started to record the Brothers and Sisters album, bassist Barry Oakley, who had been having major problems with depression, drugs, and alcohol since the death of Duane, ran his Triumph motorcycle into a bus about 3 blocks from where Duane had his fatal motorcycle accident the year before. Refusing medical help, Barry went home, but a few hours later was rushed back to the hospital, where he died from a cerebral swelling caused by a skull fracture. After Barry's death, the band went on to finish the album and hired another bass player named Lamar Williams. Barry had been working with the band on some of the tracks for the Brothers and Sisters album, and one of his last songs was Ramblin' Man. The entire group was initially reluctant to record that song. "We knew it was a good song, but it didn't sound like us," said drummer Butch Trucks. And Butch was right, it didn't sound like the Allman Brothers style. Which leads me to say something here that I'm sure many have thought. The Allman Brothers Band has always been considered one of the first country rock/southern rock bands. They were the ones who started it all. But before they cut Ramblin' Man, I really never heard a southern or country rock song out of them. To me, this band was so much more blues and jazz driven. So how did they get labeled a country rock or southern rock band before that? I loved their music before Ramblin' Man and after. But before, they just didn't seem to be a country rock group at all. So maybe you can enlighten me if you have any thoughts on that. Now back to Ramblin' Man. This was a song Dickie wrote and sang, and it did sound very country rock, and I think this has a lot to do with Dickie's early roots in music. Either way, it became the best-selling song the Allman Brothers Band would ever record. The whole album represented the Allman Brothers' commercial peak. It has sold over 7 million copies worldwide, landing it at the time atop of the top 200 pop albums for 5 weeks. Ramblin' Man became the band's first and only real hit single, peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100s in 1973. The album was followed by a tour of arenas and stadiums, but it was also the beginning of the end, marred by drug problems, strained friendships, and miscommunication. Things would never really be the same. With the loss of Dwayne and Barry, and Greg working on his solo project during the recording of the Brothers and Sisters album, and Dickie ended up doing the same later on, they would finally end up calling it quits a few years later and scattering out. Get back together in the 80s, which lasted a bit, then break apart again, then get back together in the 90s, and on and on. It was pretty hard to keep up with them all. Dickie would work on solo recordings and start his own group named Great Southern, and then the Dickie Betts Band. He played out and toured with them when he wasn't getting back together with a version of the Allman Brothers for a reunion. One day he was sent a fax back around 2000 that he was not needed anymore in the Allman Brothers Band. He called Greg and asked him what was going on, and he said Greg told him to listen to the tapes. So of course lawsuits started to fly. Some say the band let go of Dickie because he was drinking far too much and it was affecting his playing. I mean, come on. Next to Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Allman Brothers were just a short step behind them in being the southern rock party animals. So it's anybody's guess. Maybe by then the others had straightened up, and Dickie just didn't. All you can do really is speculate. But no matter, his feelings were hurt, and he was a founding member, and they kicked him out. There was bad blood between them for a long time, but Dickie does say that after Greg started to go downhill from liver cancer, that they did bury the hatchet and visited and talked on the phone frequently right up until Greg passed away in May of 2017. Drummer Butch Trucks died a little before Greg in 2017 of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, which now only leaves drummer percussionist J. Mo Johansson and Dickie left of the founding members. Dickie suffered a mild stroke in 2018, and he did come back and start playing around Florida some after that, but he really hasn't played anything else that I could see. On his website it says that Great Southern will reform and start touring again. It reads, Dickie Betts has sanctioned his 80s band Great Southern to reform with guitar superstar Leroy Parnell filling his role. Come and see Great Southern performing all of the Betts and Allman Brothers favorites. Looks like they have dates booked starting at the end of July this year, 2023. Dickie Betts will turn 80 years old in December of this year. He was inducted with the band into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1995. He wrote some of the great hits like Ramblin' Man and Blue Sky, as well as his 1996 Grammy Award-winning instrumental, Jessica. I don't know if we'll see him out and about playing again or not, but I sure hope so. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the video stream. All that Duane achieved in such a short period of time here on Earth. He was only down here just a month shy of 25 years. How he got this great sound and feel to his slide guitar playing. Well, I found some information that just might surprise you on that. So let's take a few minutes and look back a little on his childhood and growing up to how he became this guitarist who could play almost any style he wanted, his guitars and amps, and how he put together what some consider one of the greatest bands ever, and how he made that slide wail. He lived his life full throttle ahead, and I really doubt he had much time to look back as he was too busy moving forward till the very end of his life. So let's try and do that now and take a look back at Duane Allman. Howard Duane Allman was born on November 20th, 1946 in Nashville, Tennessee. His father's name was Willis and his mother was Geraldine, known as Jerry. Willis was murdered when Duane was 3 years old. He was a second lieutenant on active duty in the United States Army, having served as an Army non-commissioned officer during World War II. He was murdered the day after Christmas on December 26, 1949, when his family was living near Norfolk, Virginia. The story appeared in the newspaper on Tuesday, December 27, 1949, with the headlines, Army Lieutenant Robbed and Slain in Princess Anne. The location is still not an annexed part of Norfolk. It seems as though Willis Allman and another officer, Robert Buchanan, age 28, were targeted. The afternoon of December 26, they met a hitchhiker in Oriental Gardens restaurant at the corner of what was then Cottage Toll Road and Granby Street. The three played shuffleboard at the restaurant until about 6:45 before heading over to another joint, where they played more shuffleboard and had several drinks. Afterward, the hitchhiker asked for a ride to Jimmy's Drive-In. Soon after arriving there, the man who was seated in the back seat of the car asked to be taken home and directed Allman and Buchanan off to what is now Tidewater Drive and what was then mostly an open field. It was there, near a place called Lambert's Farm, where the hitchhiker drew a small automatic pistol and ordered Allman and Buchanan out of the car. He took their wallets and made Buchanan give up his shoes before ordering them to walk farther into the darkness of the open field. He ordered them to lie face down. It was then that Allman is believed to have lunged for the gun. As Buchanan ran toward a farmhouse off in the far distance, he heard 2 shots. When he returned, the hitchhiker had sped off in the car as Allman lay in the field, dead from a bullet wound to the chest. Willis was 31 years old the night of the murder. His wife Geraldine and their sons was visiting family for the holidays in North Carolina. The killer, Michael Robert Green, was convicted of the murder and sentenced to die in the electric chair. On January 22, 1952, one day before his electrocution, Michael Green's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In 1975, Michael Green was released from prison by the parole board. So Duane and his brother Greg grew up without a father. In 1955, their mother sent Duane and Greg to Castle Heights Military Academy in Lebanon, Tennessee, which they both did not enjoy at all. But she did this so she could train as a CPA. In 1957, after finishing her schooling, Jerry Allman moved herself and her 2 boys to Daytona Beach, Florida. Duane was 11 years old, and both him and his brother Greg could not have been happier. They rented a few places when they got there, and then moved into a new home on 100 Van Avenue, right off Highway A1A in Daytona Shores in 1959. The following year, his brother Greg bought his first guitar. That same year, Dwayne got a 165 Harley-Davidson motorcycle for his 14th birthday, or as some say, a Christmas present. This was in November or December of 1960, and I would guess it looked something like the one in the picture. I read where it was blue, but never did find out the model. They only made these bikes from 1953 through 1959, so my guess is Dwayne's was a used one. There's a lot of different stories about Dwayne and his first guitar. One even said he just started playing his brother Greg's. But how he got his first Gibson seemed pretty much to be about 6 months after he got his motorcycle. Dwayne rode it into the ground. He sold it for spare parts, and with that money, he bought a Gibson Les Paul Jr. But later on, he said his mother bought it. We'll get into more of that a little bit later. That fall, Dwayne was sent back up to Castle Heights Military Academy. Seems he might have been getting a little out of hand, and school was just not cutting it for him. So back to the academy he went, and him and some of the other guys started a band called the Misfits at the academy. But it didn't last too long, as Dwayne was finally kicked out of the military academy in the winter of 1963. Greg, who was also sent there after Dwayne, played in the Misfits too, but he finally quit in the spring of 1964. After returning home, Dwayne and Greg started playing in a band called the Escorts. They opened a show up for the Beach Boys in the spring of 1965, and later on that year they changed the band name to the Allman Joys. You know, something that always amazes me about Dwayne Allman was how he got so good so fast, especially on the slide guitar. When you think about it, Dwayne had only been playing guitar 4 or 5 years tops at this time, and he was already getting recognition. A few other players has talked about him around this time, and all of them were trying to get some licks and tips from Dwayne, and he was only 19 or 20 years old. But he already had that feel. I read in Don Felder's book that he used to head over to Daytona and hang out with Dwayne and the band. One day, Dwayne sat with him, helping him with the slide guitar. Don said that the best lesson he got was some advice Dwayne gave him. He said, "Close your eyes and listen to the music, man. Feel it in your heart, and when your spine tingles, you know it's right." There are a lot of conflicting stories on just when Dwayne started playing slide. Some say it was as late as 1968. Some, like Don, say earlier. Either way, his slide playing had an unmistakable sound. Here's what I think is the answer to how he did it. Some of his sound came from the way he approached his playing. Dickie Betts is the one who summed it all up, and here's what he had to say. Dwayne Allman was a fantastic interpreter. A lot of people don't realize it, but Dwayne used to tell me a lot that he was influenced by harmonica players more than guitar players. On his slide playing, Dwayne used to profess to me that slide playing ain't about guitars, it's about harmonica. You got to think like a harp player. And it makes a hell of a lot of sense. Now, I have never heard anybody who plays slide say that. And if you listen to his playing, it does sound like a harmonica. So he had a very unique approach to his music to begin with. He looked at it inside out and outside in and sideways. I think Dickie really sheds light on how the music mind of Dwayne worked. He was far and away older on the inside than he was on the outside. And I want to say here also, if you listen to his brother Greg sing at a young age, he had the soul of an old man's voice. Maybe it was just something in their genes. I really don't know. Do you? As far as some of the equipment Dwayne owned and used, there are many stories out there. Some we just have to take with a grain of salt. One was his Les Paul Jr. This was the one that comes with a few stories on how he got it. One story says he wrecked his motorcycle his mother bought him for either a birthday or a Christmas present and sold the parts that were left of the bike and bought it. And another story is his mother just bought it for him. Either way, in the early years, Dwayne probably learned on this guitar. Here's a story about the guitar. Prior to fame and renown, Dwayne Allman used this guitar from 1961 to 1965, as is presumed. He allegedly pawned it not only to upgrade, but to get some cash. And then his friend singer-songwriter Delaney Bromlett would purchase Dwayne's pawned Les Paul Jr. Now here's what Delaney had to say in an interview. Well, I went down and there stood this little red, it's a Les Paul Jr. sitting there. It's all scrubby looking, you know. So I took it back to the hotel. I walked in with that little red guitar and Dwayne said, "Where'd you get that?" I said, "I found it in a hock shop." He said, "Well, boy, that looks familiar to me. Would you look on the back of it? Is there a gouge on it that looks like a big old thumb gouge?" And I raised it up and I looked and said, "Yeah." Dwayne said, "That's where I hocked that bastard. We were coming through here and I was broke and I wanted to get high and wanted to get drunk, but I didn't have no money. So I hocked that sumbitch." And then he said, "That was the first guitar my mama gave me." Kunio Kishida, a collector musician from Japan, now owns this guitar. The guitar resides most times at the Big House Museum in Macon, Georgia, where it can be seen on display. Dwayne owned a few Fenders, but for the most part he played Gibsons. You see him a lot in the early years playing what looked like a 335 with a Bigsby tailpiece on it and a Fender amps. Later on he moved to the Les Pauls and those 50-watt Marshalls. I guess his most famous guitar was that 57 Gold Top he played on Eric Clapton's sessions in the fall of 1970. I have read and heard stories he owned 2 of those Gold Tops. Supposedly the one he played on that session he traded for that 59 Sunburst he was playing there at the last. Traded that 57 and a Marshall 50-watt head and $200 for it. I did read he also insisted on swapping pickups with the guy. So the 59 had the Gold Top pickups in it, and the 57 had the Sunburst pickups in it at the end of the deal. Maybe some of you watching can shed more light on this subject. There are quite a few books and stories out there all contradicting each other on this. One thing we know for sure, Dwayne always had great tone. I think for the most part he used that 57 in his sessions work at Muscle Shoals and an old Strat he had. There is a website out there that has all of the sessions Dwayne played on listed, and you can just click them on and check them out. This guy was an unbelievable session player. He played on songs like gospel tunes, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and then switch over to Boz Scaggs doing Loan Me a Dime. I'll leave a link to this in the description box below in this video. I highly recommend you go check out all of the songs. It is just amazing how versatile he was. After doing session work, Dwayne got tired or bored or whatever Dwayne got and decided to put another band together. So he came into Jacksonville looking for players. One day he stopped by his drummer friend Butch Truck's house. Here's how Butch tells the story. He says, "I was married living back in Jacksonville, just about to give up on the music business and go back to college and finish my degree in math. I guess that would have led to a nice teaching job somewhere. When there was a knock at my door, and there was Dwayne with this muscle-bound black dude with an afro, a tank top, and a damn bear-tooth claw necklace around his neck. As only Dwayne could, he said, 'Butch, this is J-Mo, my new drummer. J-Mo, this is Butch, my old drummer.' Well, they came in. Dwayne hung around for a while and then headed to go see Barry Oakley and just left me and J-Mo sitting there. Well, my upbringing didn't really prepare me for this. If you know J-Mo, he is a man of few words. He just sat there frowning and staring at the floor, and all I could think was, my God, this militant is going to kill me. He wound up staying with me for a few weeks that trip and has become my very dear friend and partner for 42 years since that day. What a wonderful way for a middle-class white Southern boy to be introduced to the real world. Thank you, J-Mo. It turned out Dwayne had gotten really bored with session playing, and the reason he was in Jacksonville was to start a new band. Once word got around, this became the focal point for the hippie community in Jacksonville, and we started getting together at least once a week, setting up huge piles of gear and jamming all day long. After a while, Dwayne had pretty much decided on who he wanted in his band. J-Mo came with him, Barry Oakley was the bass, and Barry convinced Dwayne that Dickie Betts would be a very cool twist to things. Damn, Barry was right. There were several drummers trying for the spot, too. J-Mo kept telling Dwayne that I was the one. But back then, I was a pretty introverted player. Humility was what I had been taught, and humility and rock and roll don't really go together. I think Dwayne decided that J-Mo was right, but I also think that he felt I needed an attitude adjustment if I was going to play in his band. I'll never forget the day we were jamming in an open field surrounded by woods next to the #1 AM radio station in Jacksonville, WAPE. Well, we got into a shuffle and it really wasn't going anywhere. I did my usual, oh God, they're all looking at me, and pulled back. Dwayne turned around, stared me square in the eyes, and played a screaming lick that just yelled, "Come on, motherfucker, play." To which I further retreated. Well, he did it again, and I pulled back again, but then on the third or fourth time I realized that he was showing me up in front of all those people, and I started to get mad. I began to beat my drums like I was hitting him upside the head. We kept this up for quite a while. I mean, we were locked eye to eye, glaring at each other, and the music just took off. In my anger, I forgot to be afraid and started playing the drums. Finally, Dwayne smiled, pointed at me, and said, "There you go." It was like he reached inside of me and flicked a switch. The light went off in my head. You can play, so stop apologizing. It was that epiphany that made me capable of doing what I have done for the last 42 plus years. It was Dwayne that caused that epiphany. Dwayne Allman was the most powerful character I have ever known. After 40 years, I still have dreams that I run into him. There's a part of me that will not let him go. He most certainly changed my life and touched the lives of everyone fortunate enough to be around him. He asked me to join the band. We started rehearsal and learned a few tunes, Trouble No More being the first. Then he called his baby brother. He was absolutely right that there was no one else alive that could sing in that band. So that is basically how the Allman Brothers Band got started, according to Butch. Dwayne was the leader, no doubt, and put it all together. And as always, he seemed to bring out the best in all musicians he played with. Some of that early Allman Brothers music I still listen to, and even today will make the hairs on my arms stand straight up. Many label them as a Southern rock band, but they were much more than that. Just listen to that live Fillmore album. Songs like Whipping Post and Memory of Elizabeth Reed. Maybe they got that label later on after Dwayne passed away. I don't really know. Most all of us know Dwayne was killed in a motorcycle accident at age 24. There's been many books and documentaries about him, and so many stories told. His short life here on Earth was, as I said in the beginning, full throttle ahead. Dwayne always got the recognition he deserved when it came to his music, but I never hear many people talk about how great he got in such a short time. At the most, he probably only played guitar a dozen or so years of his life, and in that time, he became one of the all-time best and most versatile at it. Thank you all for watching. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the video stream. Greg Allman was the vocalist, songwriter, and keyboard player for the Allman Brothers Band. His life was a long and rocky road. When he was 2 years old, his father was murdered on the day after Christmas. Him and his older brother Dwayne were sent off to military school while their mother worked and went back to school herself, studying to become a CPA. He became very close to his older brother Dwayne, but when Greg was 23, his older brother was killed in a motorcycle accident. If there was really one person Greg looked up to, it was his brother, and now he was gone. The last time they spoke, they argued when Dwayne accused Greg of dipping into a stash of cocaine. Greg lied and denied it. Later on, Greg would say, "I have thought of that lie every day of my life." I told him that lie, and then he told me that he was sorry and that he loved me. Greg Allman was born December 8, 1947. Growing up was a hard row to hoe for Greg, as was his life later on. When his mother Geraldine, known to everyone as Jerry, sent him and his brother Dwayne off to military school, he always felt it was to get him out of the way. Now, after he grew up, he realized it was her only choice, as she had to have time to work and go back to school to get herself a career to where she could make a decent life for herself and her two boys. At that time, the little boy couldn't understand that. Greg admits he grew up resenting his mom for this. In 1957, after finishing her schooling, Jerry Allman moved herself and her two boys to Daytona Beach, Florida, and both him and his brother Dwayne could not have been happier. The family rented a few places there and then moved into a new home on 100 Van Avenue, right off of Highway A1A in Daytona Shores, and this was in 1959. The next year, Greg bought his first guitar. Now, Dwayne got himself a motorcycle for his birthday, but spent a lot of time borrowing Greg's guitar. And when the old motorcycle fell apart, Dwayne sold it for parts and bought himself a guitar. Now both of the Allman boys had one. It seemed Greg and Dwayne were both starting to get in a little trouble around Daytona at that time, and their mother thought it would be a good idea for the boys to head back to Castle Heights Military School once again. They both played in their first band up there. It was called the Misfits. Then Dwayne was either kicked out, or in Greg's words, Dwayne just quit the academy and went back home to Daytona. In the spring of 1964, Greg left too, returning home. It was around this time the brothers started a band called the Escorts. They opened a show up for the Beach Boys in the spring of 1965, and later on that year they changed the name of the band to the Allman Joys. The Allman Joys primarily played a mix of rhythm and blues, soul, and rock covers. The band gained some regional recognition, especially for their live performances. The repertoire included songs by artists such as James Brown, Wilson Pickett, and Otis Redding. After the Allman Joys disbanded, Greg and Dwayne went on to form various other groups, including the Hourglass, before ultimately co-founding the Allman Brothers Band. And while the Allman Joys and Hourglass might not have reached the height of fame that the Allman Brothers Band later achieved, their role in the musical journey of Greg and his brother Dwayne is significant. It was a stepping stone that contributed to the development of their musical identities and set the stage for the success that would follow later. Around this time, the Vietnam War was raging, and everyone feared the draft. And at 18, Greg was no different. After getting his notice, Greg needed to find a way to get out of it so they could keep on playing, and big brother Dwayne was there to lend a hand. Dwayne, who was exempt because of their father, who was a second lieutenant in the United States Army, was dead, and Dwayne, being the oldest son, was considered exempt from the draft. Now, Greg tells the story differently, and that Dwayne just walked out and they forgot about him. But I just can't believe that one. Anyhow, Dwayne had cooked up a scheme to get his younger brother out of the draft. He had to have Greg shoot himself in the foot in order to get a medical pass. And being the guys that they were, Dwayne and Greg decided to make this into a party. At the party, Greg got cold feet, or maybe a cold foot. Dwayne said to him that he invited these girls over to see a foot shooting, and now you're going to let them down? Greg had drawn a target on his moccasin, placing it carefully between two of the bones in his foot so as to cause minimal damage. After more coaxing by Dwayne, Greg slammed down 2 more shots of whiskey, made a quick phone call, and came back outside with a small handgun. In the distance, a siren wailed. Greg pointed the gun at the target on his moccasin and shot. Now give credit to Greg, because in a remarkable act of good judgment, he had called the ambulance before he pulled the trigger. The next day, he hobbled into the Army recruitment office and got his medical exemption. The Hourglass ended up in California and recorded a few albums. And if you listen close into and between the production of these songs, you can hear the promise in Greg's vocals and Duane's guitar. What was to become the Allman Brothers Band was there, but Duane knew this wasn't the sound they were looking for, so he left and started doing studio work back in Muscle Shoals. Greg stayed behind in California. When Duane got tired or bored with the session work, he went to Jacksonville, Florida, and stopped by his old friend's house, drummer Butch Trucks, and said he was ready to put a band together. And that's what he did. This was where J-Mo, Barry Oakley, Dickie Betts, Butch, and Duane would start the Allman Brothers Band. All they needed was a singer, and Duane said there was only one singer for this group, and that was his little brother Greg. Duane called Greg, who was out in California, and told him he had the band. All they needed was him. So Greg caught a ride across country, and once there, the Allman Brothers Band was complete. Besides his vocal and organ playing, Greg's songwriting was an important part to the start of the band. The style of songwriting Greg felt was a unique blend from all of the black blues and soul musicians, in particular Muddy Waters, Ray Charles, and James Brown. Greg's lyrics were always known for their depth of emotion and authenticity. As a songwriter, Greg wrote several of the Allman Brothers hits, including Whipping Post, Melissa, and Midnight Rider, which he dubbed "Song I'm Most Proud of in My Career." But he could be very slow when writing, only working on songs when inspiration struck. Many times in life, Greg would have trouble expressing what was inside of him. Life on the road with the Allman Brothers wasn't always easy. Drinking since he was a teen, Greg said drugs came as second nature, and by 19 he was snorting heroin and cocaine. After the death of his brother Duane, life would drastically change for Greg. He said he didn't start grieving Duane's death until 10 years after he was gone. He said that you can't cry while you're on cocaine, and that helped him get through the funeral. To try and get a grasp on Greg and his personal life, between 1971 and 1981, he was married 4 times. He would go on to marry 3 more times after that. He would father 5 children, 3 with various wives and 2 with other women he had relationships with. Greg kind of put it all in perspective by saying, "Every woman I've ever had a relationship with has loved me for who they thought I was." This makes me wonder if anyone ever really knew Greg. His 3rd wife, Cher, who attended his funeral, had this to say about Greg: "A kind, loving man, and a mystery to all of us at times." After his brother Duane's death, and then a year later the death of bassist Barry Oakley, Greg tried to keep the band going. But by 1976, the band was to break up for a time. Many believe that the drugs and alcohol and power struggles between Greg and guitarist Dickie Betts was the cause, and really, it's anybody's guess. Greg would go and record solo albums and start his own band and do some touring. It kept his name out there. But as the 80s rolled in and the southern country rock started slowing down in the mainstream music, Greg would stick to his roots in the blues. I think he felt safe there because that's what was in his heart. Greg, like most addicts, would try and get off drugs, and then his alcohol consumption would escalate. Greg says his normal was to drink a quart of vodka a day. His low point came January 12, 1995, the night the Allman Brothers Band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, I remember watching it that night and seeing Greg look like death warmed over and hardly able to talk. I figured it was about over for him. Willie Nelson, who inducted them, asked him before walking out there if he was all right, and he said, "Willie, I'm not all right." His acceptance speech lasted all of 20 seconds.
Thank you, folks. In honor of the greatest friend, brother, guitar player, and inspiration I've ever known, my brother Dwayne was always the first to face the fire. He was my greatest motivation. Thank you.
Greg had so much he wanted to say that night, but that was all he was able to get out. This is how Greg described it in his book. It should have been the greatest week of my life, but instead I hit an all-time low. The Allman Brothers Band, the band my brother started, the band with our name on it, was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I flat out missed it. I was physically there, but otherwise I was out of it, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. I was drunk, man, just shit-faced drunk the entire time. Welcome to the story of my life. After watching the video of it a few days later, Greg said he was appalled at himself. He said he broke down and cried like a baby and prayed. He had been to rehab 14 times. This time he says he hired a male nurse to come in who had worked at rehab and knew all about it, and just bit the bullet until the stuff was out of his system. Cleaned up and feeling better, Greg would get the Allman Brothers Band back together. There'd be some member changes off and on, but they were still a huge draw at live performances. Greg would write and they would record some more albums, but as time moved on, Greg's health was deteriorating. Those hard years of drinking and drugging took its toll on him. He had had hepatitis C for many years, but now it was getting worse, with cirrhosis and soon cancer of the liver. He was to receive a liver transplant in 2010, and he would recover, but the cancer would return a few years later. Greg would pass away at his home in Richmond Hills, Georgia, on May 27, 2017. He was 69 years old. Greg Allman had one of those voices that could deliver a song to your heart. Nothing fancy. He didn't have great range or power. He just made you feel it. Some of the lyrics he wrote were so heartfelt. He had a lot of trouble trying to express himself in life and sometime even in his songwriting. I'm sure he probably left us with a lot more to give had he figured out how. The comment section is open for you all to tell us your Greg Allman stories and favorite songs and performances. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate it. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the video stream. When putting the Allman Brothers Band together, Dwayne Allman didn't want somebody who just played bass. He wanted someone who was capable of taking the instrument and the music to a different level. In Barry Oakley, he found the perfect person, in more ways than one. They also had the same thoughts and beliefs on how to make it in music, playing the style they both loved. Raymond Barry Oakley III was born in Chicago and grew up just south of there in Park Forest, Illinois. So how did a kid who played lead guitar in a band out of Chicago end up in Jacksonville, Florida, and become the bass player for one of the most iconic Southern rock bands in history? Fate, destiny, or luck? Whatever you want to call it, this is probably one of the most fascinating stories you'll ever hear. I really do think that Barry Oakley was never given the recognition he deserved. Yes, he was a great bass player, holding down the Allman Brothers rhythm section with drummers J-Mo and Butch Trucks. If you listen to his playing closely, he would also take it up into the lead section at critical points during a song. He had an uncanny knack of knowing just when and where to do this to get the most out of it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let's find out how he got to that point. As I said, Barry Oakley was born in Chicago and grew up and went to school in Park Forest, a suburb south of Chicago. While attending Rich East High School, Barry played in a local band called the Shanes. Barry was considered one of the better lead guitar players in the area back in the 60s. A friend and a fellow musician said Barry used to play a forest green Strat through a 212 Sears Silvertone amp back then, and sounded great. As his band, the Shanes, gained popularity in the local area, they got to play with some pretty big name acts of the time, including the Byrds. One of the groups they played shows with quite a bit was Tommy Roe's backup band, the Romans. Tommy Roe had some success with hit songs like Sheila and Dizzy, to name a few, and used the Romans as needed to back him on some gigs. The Romans band is where Barry Oakley got a break. Joe Pappalardo, the bass player for the Romans, was drafted into the Vietnam War. Barry saw the opportunity, and although he had never played bass, asked him for a shot at the gig. They said okay. Now, Barry had a musician friend who played bass give him a crash course, and in 2 weeks he was ready to head out. He quit high school and started playing with the Romans. The Romans had formed on the west coast of Florida just north of the Clearwater Beach area, and they would often play gigs around that area too. So this was the first known time that Barry Oakley would visit Florida. Now the Romans had another musician in the group who would go on to have success in music, and that was drummer Bertie Higgins. This name might sound familiar with some of you, some maybe not. But Bertie Higgins would end up helping write and then recording a hit with the song Key Largo in 1981. The song would peak at number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and remain on the charts for 17 weeks. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. Now, there isn't much information as to when and why Barry left the Romans, but one thing we know is he didn't leave Florida. He stuck around the Tampa Clearwater area playing beach bars with a few different groups. Now down south and across Tampa Bay is the town of Sarasota. This is where Dickie Betts was fronting a top 40 cover band called Soul Children. The band played all over the area, and somewhere, somehow, Dickie was to run in to Barry Oakley, and he really liked what he saw and heard in this long-haired bass player who resembled Jesus. Barry had dreams and aspirations. He talked with Dickie about doing original songs and getting out of the bar band circuit. Barry joined Dickie, along with drummer John Meeks, guitarist Larry Reinhardt, and keyboardist Dale Betts, which was Dickie's wife. Now this band became the Blues Messengers. There's one recording out there of the Blues Messengers I found. It's on YouTube, and it's really wild sounding. Not a great recording, but you can hear Dickie and Barry play in the early years. I'll leave a link to this song. It's called High Wednesday, and I'll leave the link in the video description. Dickie Betts was quoted as saying, besides his bass playing abilities, Barry Oakley's commitment to working on original music really inspired him. But it also inspired another up-and-coming guitar player who had just left his job as a session player at the Muscle Shoals recording studio. His name was Duane Allman, and he was looking to put a band together. By 1968, the Blues Messengers had migrated through some personal changes and relocated to Jacksonville, Florida, changing their name to the Second Coming. Dickie said, Duane started showing up and sitting in with Barry and myself with our band in Jacksonville. Duane was planning on going to Capricorn Records with a trio. It was going to be Duane, Barry Oakley, and J-Mo. Phil Walden, co-founder of Capricorn, had approached Duane and told him to put a group together, a trio. So Duane started showing up and setting in with Barry and myself with our band in Jacksonville. So Barry and Duane were kind of getting used to playing with each other, getting ready to go into this new venture. As we started jamming, we all realized that Duane and I played harmony guitars together was something that we weren't expecting to hear. And as legend has it, it was Barry who refused to leave without Dickie. However, the details were finally worked out. It was around this time the Allman Brothers were born, with Barry Oakley as a founding member on bass guitar. Duane and Barry didn't really live long enough to give many interviews, so there isn't very much information that came directly from their mouths about events and how they felt. But one thing that sticks out in my mind, we know that Duane was the driving force behind the band. Everyone says that. But we also know what Dickie had to say about Barry through countless interviews throughout his life, saying things like, Barry was convinced there was an audience for the improvisational blues-based music. Dickie ended by calling Barry a real visionary. So for myself, I have a deep feeling that there was a strong connection and a bond, so to speak, between Duane and Barry. One thing that we might never know about because, as I said, neither one lived long enough to tell their side, but it sure seems that way to me. Barry's playing was the perfect match for the Allman Brothers Band. He had become a great bass player. Consider this. He started playing bass around the age of 18 and tragically died in a motorcycle accident at age 24. Some of his finest work on albums were done between the ages of 21 and 24. He was just a month shy of his 23rd birthday when the Live at the Fillmore album was recorded. Still, today, it is considered one of the best live albums ever created. His tone was always spot on. He played a Guild Starfire and a Fender Jazz bass for the most part. Now, the Jazz was anything but stock. It was nicknamed the tractor bass. It was customized with a Guild pickup, manufactured by Hagstrom, from my understanding. I could go on about this guitar, but instead, I want to leave another link in the description. This is a link to Barry's grandson's channel. The video was recorded about 10 years ago, but he explains the guitar and plays it some too. So drop by and check it out to learn more about this guitar and leave a comment for his grandson Sean. Like I said, in my opinion, Barry was underrated as a bass player. He was a force in the Allman Brothers Band. We know he had the attitude needed to take the band to a higher level. And I'm sure Duane saw all those qualities in Barry too. Let's hear your thoughts and feelings on Barry Oakley. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the video stream. There's just a very small handful of guitarists who took their playing to a point where you hear a song and you know right away who it was. Duane Allman was one of those players. Howard Duane Allman was born on November 20th, 1946, and probably started playing a guitar sometime in 1960. That's when his little brother Greg bought his first one. Greg says Duane spent a lot of time borrowing that guitar. Then around a year later, Duane sold an old 165 Harley-Davidson motorcycle he had received as a present for either his birthday or a Christmas present and bought his own guitar. It was said to have been a Les Paul Jr., and this would have been sometime in 1961. 10 years later, Duane would be dead. Even now, long after Duane's death, people talk about what could have been. But this video's not about what could have been, but what was. And it all happened in 10 short years. After getting his own guitar, Duane and little brother Greg would jam and learn songs they heard on the radio. But they were also getting into a lot of trouble, too. Their mom, Jerry, had her hands full trying to raise two boys alone. Her husband, Duane and Greg's father, had been murdered years before in 1949. He had been in the United States Army at the time, so after his death, Jerry had sent the boys off to military school and went back to school herself. She became a CPA, and after she completed her schooling, she took her boys and moved to the Daytona Beach, Florida area. As Duane and Greg headed into their teen years and became a bit hard for her to handle, she decided to send them back up to Castle Heights Military Academy in Lebanon, Tennessee for a second time. It was there the boys would start their first band, called the Misfits. Then Duane was either kicked out, or in Greg's words, Duane just quit the academy and went back home to Daytona. And in the spring of 1964, Greg left the academy too. With both boys back home in Daytona, the brothers started a band, calling it the Escorts. They played local gigs and even opened a show up for the Beach Boys in the spring of 1965. Later on that same year, they changed the name of the band to the Allman Joys. The Allman Joys primarily played a mix of rhythm and blues, soul, and rock covers. The band gained some regional recognition, especially for their live performances. Duane had been playing guitar around 5 years at this time. He was 18 years old, and his reputation was growing. Duane was the kind of person, if he wanted something, he went after it. As one of his friends said at the time, it was best to get out of his way or he'd run over you. I think it was around this time Duane put everything he had into his guitar playing. This was also around the time he first put the slide on his finger. There have been some great slide guitars. Just to name a few of my favorites, Johnny Winter, Ry Cooder, Billy Gibbons, Warren Haynes, and of course, Derek Trucks, who I consider the best out there today. Now feel free to name some of your favorites in the comments section, as there are many more to choose from. But all of these slide players have something Duane Allman didn't: time. They have all had 30 or 40 years of time to perfect their skills with the slide. Duane had maybe 5 or 6 years at the most to work on his slide playing. I quoted Dickie Betts in another video I did a couple of years back, but I think this really hit the mark on Duane and his slide playing and just his overall guitar work. Dickie said, Duane Allman was a fantastic interpreter. A lot of people don't realize it. Duane used to tell me a lot that he was influenced by harmonica players more than guitar players. On his slide playing, Duane used to profess to me that slide playing ain't about guitars. It's about harmonica. You got to think like a harp player, and it makes a hell of a lot of sense. Now, I've never heard anybody who plays slides say that. And if you listen to his playing, it does sound like a harmonica. So he had a very unique approach to his music to begin with. He looked at it inside out and outside in and sideways. I think Dickie really shed some light on how the musical mind of Duane works. He was far and away older on the inside than he was on the outside. And I also want to say here, if you listen to his brother Greg sing at a young age, he had the soul of an old man in his voice. Maybe it was something in their genes. I really don't know. Do you? In 1967, Duane and Greg would change the name of their band from the Allman Joys to Hourglass. They would land a contract from Liberty Records and move out to Los Angeles and record a couple of albums, although the albums didn't do too well. If you listen close into and in between the production of these songs, you can hear the promise in Greg's vocals and that Duane's guitar playing had grown up drastically. What was to become the Allman Brothers Band was there, but Duane knew this wasn't the sound they were looking for. So after a few years, they left L.A. In a last-ditch effort after leaving Los Angeles, the Hourglass recorded some demos at the famed studio in Muscle Shoals, Alabama in April of 1968. They laid down a handful of tracks that showed their full potential in the studio. After these tracks were rejected by Liberty, the group returned to the Southeast and did a few more gigs and then called it quits. Fortunately, however, producer Rick Hall and the Fame gang were impressed by the demos, and Duane was eventually asked to work on a session which quickly led to steady employment at Fame. Dwayne would end up camping out at the studio in a tent and later rent a small cabin on a lake close by and do session work for other artists. During his time at the Muscle Shoals studio, Dwayne would put his mark on some of the most timeless recordings to come out in that era. Wilson Pickett's cover of the Beatles' Hey Jude, Clarence Carter's The Dynamic Clarence Carter, Arthur Conley's More Sweet Soul, and King Curtis's Grammy Award-winning cover of the band's The Weight, which Dwayne's slide guitar work still to this day will put you in awe. The Wilson Pickett cover of the Beatles' Hey Jude is the song Eric Clapton took notice to hearing Dwayne's guitar work. Eric said, "I remember hearing Wilson Pickett's Hey Jude and just being astounded by the lead break at the end. I had to know who that was immediately, right now." Later, in 1970, Eric would be sitting front row for an Allman Brothers show, and after inviting them back to Criteria Studios in Miami, Florida, where Dwayne would lay down a few notes of slide to the song Layla, and in the words of Allman Brothers Band drummer Butch Trucks, put the fire that was missing in that song. Dwayne Allman would leave his footprints all over the Layla and Assorted Love Songs album. After working sessions at Fame Studio, Dwayne would decide he wanted to get back to playing in a band again, as he was tiring of session work. He would get the wheels rolling and put together the Allman Brothers Band, and what a great band it was. Some of that early Allman Brothers music I still listen to, and even today will make the hairs on my arms stand straight up. Many label them as a southern rock band, but they were much more than that. Just listen to that Live at the Fillmore album. Songs like Whipping Post and In the Memory of Elizabeth Reed. Maybe they got that label later on after Dwayne passed away. I don't really know, but I never could understand that southern rock thing at all. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you all think the style of music that the Allman Brothers Band played should be called? Dwayne loved playing live through those 50-watt Marshalls cranked up to 10. He had one of the best hot tube sounds ever. He played with so much feeling and heart, whether he was in the studio or on stage. His guitar playing stood out head and shoulders among the rest. And to think he only had a little over 10 years to get on that pinnacle. And even 50 years after his death, he's still riding high on that pinnacle in my book. Thank you all for watching and supporting the channel. If you're enjoying the video, please take a second and subscribe to the River Docs channel. Watch short documentary videos of your favorite rock, country, and blues bands and musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, back to the